Simon will be talking about Sir Robert Walpole, who 300 years ago, this year, became Britain's first Prime Minister. He will also tell us about Walpole and his connections with Richmond, including Richmond Park. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Simon Targett.
Good evening, everyone. Hello, lovely to be here again. I came to the talk that Paul Valalay gave, or was it last month, which was terrific. I gather this is on Zoom, so I'm supposed to stay relatively still, which might be difficult, but we'll see. And I've got the clicker, which should work. Okay. Actually, can I go back? How do I go back? Yeah. So, as Robert just said, the peg for this talk was the 300th anniversary of Walpole, Sir Robert Walpole, becoming the first Prime Minister, or supposedly the first Prime Minister. We'll come on to that in the talk. In April 1721, when he became First Lord of the Treasury. And actually, if you look at Downing Street, you'll see First Lord of the Treasury on the door. And that's the position that's formally attached now to the role of Prime Minister. So that was the ostensible reason, and he was the first of 55 presidents. Boris is the 55th. But I think there's perhaps another reason that's just emerged in the last few days, which gives it an extra relevance. One of the things that we find with talking about people of the past, historical figures, is it's hard to sometimes relate to them. They seem kind of wooden and so on, and very different to novel characters in a novel where there's so much sort of thought that can be put into their personalities, and we can only rely on facts and the sources that we have. But with the current sleaze crisis that's engulfing the government, I kind of think there's a sort of relevance here with Walpole. Walpole was a deeply controversial character in his day. He was often seen as the corrupter-in-chief at the time by his opponents, of course. Here, of course, you've got a former Prime Minister in John Major saying that there's a general whiff of "we are the masters now" about their behaviour, and there was a definite feeling at the time with Walpole that they were the ones in charge, and the language of oligarchy was very common. So he was a deeply controversial character at the time. He was loved by some, of course, because he lasted 21 years in office. He was loathed by others, not least because he was so good at staying in office. And historians are equally divided about him. There's a famous historian, a Marxist historian, but a historian of the working class called E.P. Thompson. You may have heard of him. And he regarded Walpole as a sort of head of a bandit state. He talked about things like the Banana Republic. He was writing in the 1970s. I think if he was writing today, he might compare him to someone like Putin, who uses the offices, the resources of office for personal enrichment. Equally, you have historians like J.H. Plum, the Cambridge historian, professor, the great biographer of Walpole. And he regarded, of course, he knew that Walpole, got wealthy in office, but he, of course, would say, well, many people did. That was the norm for the day. He would hark back to someone like Cardinal Wolsey, who was the king's minister in much the same way as Walpole was, and of course built Hampton Court. Wasn't a wealthy man originally; he was a butcher's son. So he said this has happened before, and Plum would say that Walpole's great legacy, in a way, was not his corruption, but the fact that he conferred on Britain a sense of stability. And for that, he was looking back to the 17th century, the 1600s. And if you'll remember your school history, the first 49 years, you had the two Stuarts, James I and Charles I. Charles I, at the end of a civil war, had his head chopped off. Then you had a period when there was a non-king in charge, Oliver Cromwell. And then you had subsequent battles leading to something called the Glorious Revolution in 1688. So it was a great time of trauma and terror, and people sorted out their differences through the sword. By the time of Walpole, they were sorting out their differences not through the sword, but the pen. And someone like Plum, the historian, regarded Walpole as a key instrument in making that happen. In a sense, the way you would sort out your differences was not by fighting with each other, but was with sort of arguing with each other using pamphlets and so on and so forth. So that, by way of backdrop, is a bit of why, in a way, it's useful now to talk about Walpole. And before I go directly into talking about his connections, and in a sense, one of the reasons, the way I've ordered the talk is to say that, you know, you could afterwards you do a kind of your own kind of walking tour, looking at some of the buildings that Walpole was very directly connected to. Many of them you'll know all too well in any case. But before I turn to that, let me just paint a bit of the background to Walpole himself and his time in the early, thank you very much, in the early 1700s. So he was born in 1676, and he came from Norfolk, in a little village called Houghton. He was part of the gentry. His family had been in Norfolk for generations. His father was a man called Colonel Edward Walpole, whose only claim, as far as I can tell, his only claim to fame is that he's actually in the Guinness Book of World Records for having the longest overdue book in the world. He borrowed a book in 1668, bizarrely a German book from Sidney Sussex College in Cambridge, where he was studying on an obscure archbishop called Archbishop of Bremen in German, and he never gave it back. And it was many years, it was in 1956 that the biographer J.H. Plum was rummaging through the papers at Houghton and discovered this book and returned it to Sidney Sussex. Happily, they didn't charge him for the overdue price, otherwise they could have added considerably to their endowment. So then he went to Eton, the first of 20 prime ministers who went to Eton, like Boris, and then on to King's College, Cambridge. He was actually, at that time, destined for the church, which is why he went to King's College, Cambridge. As you'll probably perhaps know, that in those days, where you appeared in the order of your family kind of determined what kind of role you would go into. So if you were the eldest son, it was always sons, not daughters, you would be destined to run the estate of your family. If you were second, you would typically go into the army, and then third, you would go into the church. So his elder brother Edward also died young. His second brother Burwell died in battle, and so that meant that he was left to have to run the estate. So he was hauled back from Cambridge, where he was studying, and then was tutored by his father until his father's death in 1700. And of course, then he succeeded his father, promptly got married, and then entered Parliament, which was the kind of done thing in those days. He was an MP for initially Castle Rising, which is a small, well, it was a rotten borough in 1701, and then he became MP in 1702 for King's Lynn, which was a very important port at this time, had a particular link with the northern German states, in particular across the North Sea. So he enters politics, and this was a time when party politics was really just getting going. We think of that's how you do politics, don't we? But it wasn't the norm until about this time. And then it was just before, maybe 20 years beforehand, when different groups were dividing into Protestant supporters and Catholic supporters. And they really orbited two groups around James Duke of York, James II, as he became of England, who was a Catholic. But when he was the Duke of York, and he is the person after whom New York is named, there was a great discussion over whether he should actually be made king because he was a Catholic. In the end, he did become a king, a Catholic king, although he didn't push his Catholicism on the people. But the politicians divided between the Protestant supporters and the Catholic supporters, and the Protestant supporters were known as Whigs, which was a term of abuse. A Whig back then was a Gaelic phrase meaning a Scottish horse thief with radical anti-Catholic views. A Tory, of course, we don't use Whig now, but we still use Tory, but I don't know how many Tories know that they originally were Irish outlaws with strong Catholic affiliations. But the word Tory has continued, of course. Walpole was a Whig. He was a Protestant supporter, when he so in the early 1700s there was a discussion over who would follow the Queen Anne. I don't know if any of you saw the film The Favourite with Olivia Colman, which was very much about her rivalry with her favourite Sarah Duke of Marlborough. But also the fact that she didn't have any heirs, and she struggled and struggled. She was pregnant 17 times. She had 12 miscarriages or stillborn children, astonishingly unfortunate. And of course, this caused great uncertainty across the country, because while she was trying to have an heir, there was a great rival across the water who was called, he was known as James III because he was recognized as such by the French, but he was the son of James II, and he wasn't recognized here in the UK. He was known as the Old Pretender, or the Pretender. The Tories were great supporters of him and wanted him to be king. The Whigs, of course, didn't. And they had very elaborate ceremonies. So the Tories would try and support James discreetly by toasting him over a bowl of water. So they would be toasting the king across the water, who was actually in the channel, a sort of subtle support of James. But when Queen Anne dies, then there was a question about who would be the next monarch. And we'll come on to that now. Actually, to the next one. So the Hanoverians, or the First Georgians. It's interesting that we all know about Georgian architecture, but that's mainly late Georgian. The early Georgians were still regarded as Hanoverians. They were the very Germanic electors of Hanover. And the man on the left, George I, succeeded Queen Anne because of a rather bizarre genealogy. He was the great-grandson of James I, James VI of Scotland, the first of the Stuarts. And originally, the next monarch was not going to be George. It was going to be the person on the left, on the right, Queen Sophia of Hanover, who was the granddaughter of James. And literally 2 months before she was due to be enthroned in Westminster, she died at the age of 83. And so we didn't get Queen Sophia, we got King George, and the first of the Georgians. And he was very he was 54 by now. He certainly didn't expect originally to be King of England. He was a German, but he was brought up and bred in the language of diplomacy, which was French. He could barely speak English, but he had this one redeeming feature, which was that he was Protestant, and he was not first in the line. Anyone know where he came in the line of Protestant succession? He wasn't first, he wasn't second, he wasn't eighth like Harry. 57th. Everyone else was Catholic before that. So he was. You can see why he probably wasn't really expecting to be made King of England. But as a result of this was in a way Walpole's great good fortune, and his family and his ilk. because it pretty much meant that George was not going to be supportive of Tory politicians. He would have to choose a minister, a servant from the Whigs. And in fact, the Tories were kept out of office for over half a century until the 1760s. I can go to the next one. So this is then really marking Walpole's kind of rise to wealth and power. He got his revenge because for a period of time in 1712 he was put in the Tower of London for spurious accusations about being corrupt. But pretty much you could lay that on pretty much everyone at this time. So he was seen as a kind of Whig martyr, and the Tower of London was not kind of a nasty dungeon. It was where gentlemen could have quite a decent have their libraries. They could carry out experiments. They could conduct their business. They just couldn't have many visitors. So it wasn't like being thrown into jail. But nevertheless, he sought his revenge when George I became king, and the Tories were kept out of office. Some of them were forced into exile and had to go to James's court in Paris. And Walpole became Paymaster General of His Majesty's forces, which was a wonderfully lucrative role. Basically, you got the money to hand out to the army for whatever purposes, but of course you could keep some yourself. And Walpole certainly did that, as did many people before him. And so really the foundation of his great wealth in office came with this role as Paymaster General of His Majesty's forces. But his route to power really came after something you've perhaps heard of, the South Sea Bubble. At the time of the financial crisis in 2008, there was talk of tulip mania, the Dutch tulip mania. There was the South Sea Bubble. There was the 1929 Wall Street crash. But the South Sea Bubble was where Walpole really came to the fore. It happened in 1720. There was this company called the South Sea Company, and it got the monopoly of trade to South America. It got supported by the King, George I, by his various German advisors, a whole number of courtiers who were often bribing others to try and stoke up the price of the stock. And then suddenly it all came crashing down, and Walpole wasn't very invested in the South Sea Company, not particularly because of his great financial acumen, although he was smart, but because of his able banker. And so he didn't invest in companies like this, for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but no one is to know what it is, that kind of company. How strange is that? But you can sort of see there were resonances in the financial crisis of 2008. But what Walpole did was protect many of the people who had got their fingers burned in the South Sea Bubble, and because of his ability to manage the House of Commons. And on the basis of that, the King had no choice particularly but to give him the role of First Lord of the Treasury. He also was Lord Chancellor as well, and it's from that point onwards that he then becomes recognised generally by historians as Prime Minister. There had been other people who had been called Prime Minister beforehand, but because of his duration in office, it really changed the game. But of course, it was seen as a term of abuse. It was seen to be because he was really only there on the will of the King, but the idea that he was the Prime Minister was the idea that he was above him, getting above himself, that he was actually somehow independent of the King's will, which he wasn't, as we'll come on to. And actually, as a term officially recognised, it wasn't until 1878 that Prime Minister was a phrase, and it was used by Disraeli in official documentation. So why did the king choose Walpole? Why was he so powerful? Well, I think there are a number of reasons. I'll pick out three. One was his ability to control the House of Commons. He was a great Commons man. In 1723, a couple of years after being made First Lord of the Treasury, he was offered a peerage. In other words, he was offered a chance to go into the House of Lords and become a bona fide aristocrat. But he turned it down because he realised that the real power, a bit like Edward Heath, he realised that real power lay in the House of Commons, and if he could control that, he could control the purse strings, and he could control both his destiny and the country's destiny. And he was able to control the Commons partly through patronage. He had access to all sorts of offices that he could give to friends and relations and so on. Partly because he was a very good speaker. There are a number of phrases that have come down to us in the English language, like "let sleeping dogs lie," "I'm no saint, no reformer, no Spartan, no reformer," "every man has his price." These are phrases that he coined in his speeches, and he had many others. So he was a very good persuader in very everyday language. And then he developed a kind of not quite common man. He was a Norfolk squire, and of course, a lot of the House of Commons was made up of gentry, not aristocrats, and so he was able to speak in very plain language. There's a phrase I'll use a bit later, which he became famous for. He would like to crunch Norfolk apples as a sort of very homely kind of thing. So in a way, just as other politicians have followed him, like we think of Maggie Thatcher's handbag, we think of Churchill's cigar, or Wilson's pipe. He didn't really smoke a pipe. He kind of just wanted to be a man of the people. These were kind of props, and Walpole was in a sense the first to do that with his crunching Norfolk apples. A second reason was that he had this ability to influence outside Parliament. So he realised that you couldn't just live in this kind of Westminster bubble. You had to think more broadly. Because if you think about it, the political season was actually quite short. So typically the King's Speech, nowadays it happens in November. Back then it happened in January or February, and the parliamentary season was over and done with by May and June, so 5 months. So he had all that other time to influence those same gentry who went back to their back to their landed estates. And it's important to also understand that these gentry were very locally based. This is their heartland, and so when they talked about county, they really thought, and often they used the words interchangeably, as their country. That was where they came from, and so Walpole realised that, and he needed to find a way to reach them. And the best source that he had at this time was the newspaper. So I put up here the Daily Courant, which was the first daily newspaper in England, from 1702. But he also sponsored newspapers. He had journalists that he paid for, and he was in a dogfight with the opposition writers who also wrote for newspapers and tried to win over opinion in the country. And of course, somewhere like Richmond was outside London, so it was very much a place for this kind of debate, where it would happen in coffee houses and also in the streets. And it was a very relatively literate population, and even if people couldn't read, they could listen. So I don't know if you ever saw that film, Tom Hanks' film, News of the World, about America, where he goes around reading newspapers out to the sort of local Americans. And it was a kind of performance. He would be standing a bit like now, reading for the newspapers to all the people that could hear. This is the kind of thing that happened back in the 1700s. So he influenced them in this way. And then there was another way in which he influenced them, and we'll come to that. Next slide, please. So I've put up here, does anyone know what WAG stands for? So WAGs is a phrase you often see in the sort of back pages of the more lurid tabloids. It stands for wives and girlfriends, and it's often associated with footballers' wives and girlfriends and the WAGs. I've actually put WAMs here because actually the word for girlfriend then was not girlfriend, it was mistress. But this wasn't some sort of underhand thing. This was a very recognized way of doing business. Women had extraordinary power if they knew how to use it. Here are two of the women that were very influential, or relatively influential at this time. So on the top right, you've got Erengard Melusine von der Schulenburg, who was later made Duchess of Kendal. She was the mistress of George I and was there at his coronation. He had separated from his wife a number of years before that. And then someone you may have come across, Henrietta Howard, who was the person who built Marble Hill sometime after she was actually a mistress of George II. So she was mistress of George II until 1734, and then he moved on to somebody else, as it were. And but he gave her a settlement. And from that she was able to buy land in Twickenham and build Marble Hill. But she was very influential as a puller of power behind the throne. But actually the most important person at this time was this lady on the left, Caroline of Ansbach, of course, another German. And she was not just the girlfriend or mistress, but the wife. And she was the real power behind the throne of George II, who was the son of George I, on the right. Interestingly, I picked out these pictures because they were by Sir Godfrey Kneller, and you'll know Godfrey Kneller is a sort of kind of local artist who's buried in Twickenham. And he was very much the sort of, kind of the David Bailey of his day. He was the one doing all the formal portraits of all the very wealthy. So Caroline of Ansbach was initially, of course, she was Princess of Wales. So when George became king, George I became king in 1714, both she and George II, Prince of Wales, came across in 1714 and set up their role as Prince and Princess of Wales. But they created a kind of separate court. There was great rivalry between, and it goes down through history, this rivalry between the king and the Prince of Wales. You can see it a little bit, can't you, with Prince Charles? But it was much more kind of dangerous at this time, and they had a quite big separation. Then it was patched up in 1717, so about 3 years after George came to power, and we'll come on to the next slide. And the reason why I've talked about the mistresses is because, of course, this was how Walpole used power. He was able to, he decided who and how to build relationships with these mistresses. And the person that he had a strongest relationship with was Caroline. In a sense, that was a good call. Now, I don't know if anyone, I didn't put the name on the slide. Does anyone recognize that building? Orleans House, that's right. So now, I see the pointer works here. So you can see here is the octagon, which still stands, and it's wonderful to go and visit. And then here's the rest of the house, which stood until 1926, but doesn't exist anymore. But this was the home of a Secretary of State for Scotland, a man called James Johnson, a wealthy, another wealthy aristocrat, and he was one of the first to build a grand mansion along the Thames this far down, and he did it partly to really entertain the royals and to win approval. and Caroline was a regular visitor, and because she was a regular visitor, Walpole was a regular visitor as well. He basically realised she was the person he needed to really get to if he was going to influence the Prince of Wales, but also the future king. And so he's putting in his homework at an early stage. So that was one place where he goes, and if you go and visit, you'll see that often it's Caroline who was allowed to dine in the octagon, and the men and others were entertained in the house. So this is a building that doesn't exist anymore. I don't know if anyone recognises this one. This is actually called Richmond Lodge, and it stood pretty much where the King's Observatory stands today, and it looked out across Sion House, which of course existed then, the Dukes of Northumberland's seat in London. And this is where Caroline and George, as Prince and Princess of Wales, came to live in 1717. So when they were kind of banished from court, they decided to move with one home in a place called Leicester House in London, and then spend all their summers here out in Richmond. And this was in the grounds of the old Richmond Palace, which we've all seen. This was part of the old deer park of Richmond Palace. Richmond Palace, by this stage, was a sorry state compared to what it had been in the days of the Tudors. So at the time of the Civil War, Oliver Cromwell sold the palace and gave Richmond Park to the City of London. But this was reclaimed when there was this restoration in 1660, when Charles II came back to power and restarted the line of kings of England. And what was interesting about this choice was that Richmond had been once, great in the Tudor period, but here it was becoming even grander as a result of George's patronage. And I'm just going to read a passage from, if I may, from Daniel Defoe's A Tour Through the Whole Island of Great Britain. I don't know if any of you have got this, but it's a wonderful read. He's, of course, the man who wrote, a journalist, but he wrote Robinson Crusoe. But he also wrote this wonderful description of England and his tour through England. And so this is his description of Richmond at this time. From hence we come to Richmond, the delightful retreat of their Royal Highnesses, the Prince and Princess of Wales, Caroline and George, and where they have spent the fine season every summer for some years. The Prince's court, being so near, must needs have filled Richmond, which was before a most agreeable retreat for the first and second-rate gentry, with a great deal of the best company in England. This town and the country adjacent increase daily in buildings, many noble houses, for the accommodation of such, being lately raised and more in prospect. Here are wells likewise, and a mineral water which, though not so much as that at Epsom or Tunbridge, are yet sufficient to keep up the forms of the place, and bring the company together in the morning, as the music does in the evening. And as there is more of quality in and about the place than is ordinarily to be seen at Epsom, the company is more shining and sometimes even illustriously bright. It is not easy to describe the beauty with which the banks of the Thames shine on either side of the river, from hence to London, much more than our ancestors, even of but one age ago, knew anything of. If for pleasant villages, great houses, palaces and gardens, it was true in Queen Elizabeth's time, according to the poet, that the Thames was royal Tiber may compare, I say, if it were true at that time, what may be said of it now, when for one fine house that was to be seen then, there are 100, nay, for aught I know, 500 to be seen now, even as you sit still in a boat and pass up and down the river. That's a wonderful passage, which, in Daniel Defoe's very journalistic kind of language. In other words, then, Richmond was arguably more prominent than it had been in Elizabeth's day, and we've all seen that little plaque on the side of Richmond Palace saying that Elizabeth died here in 1603. You could have another plaque to say how Richmond reached a new level of prominence in the age of Walpole and the 1700s. So maybe go to the next slide. So I've came to the lodge first, Richmond Lodge, because this was the scene of a very big moment in Walpole's life. We know that he lasted for 21 years, but he might not have lasted that long. So in 1727, George I unexpectedly died en route to Hanover. So he regularly went to Hanover, where he came from, and he remained hereditary elector of Hanover, which was part of the Royal Holy Roman Empire, which was the secular part, the secular power to the papacy in the centre of Europe. So he tries to get to Hanover, dies, age 67. Walpole gets the news first and wants to tell George, who of course becomes king. The king is dead, long live the king. And he makes a dash to Richmond Lodge, which was where George was spending his summer along with Caroline. He arrives in the afternoon, and actually this was a moment when George was having an afternoon nap, and so he knocks, calls in at the entrance and says, "I need to speak to the king." And the porters say, "Would you really need to, sir? He's asleep." And he said, "No, I insist. I must tell him." So George comes down, half asleep, half dressed, and is told about his father, that he's now the king. And Walpole says, "Well, who should I take instructions from now?" He was hoping, of course, that he was saying he would be reconfirmed as First Lord of the Treasury. But no, Walpole is told to go to Chiswick, where he will find Sir Spencer Compton, who is the Speaker of the House of Commons and George's close ally, where he should take instruction from him. So Walpole goes to Chiswick. Spencer Compton is not a highly rated man, and he actually then asks Walpole, "Well, actually, can you help me write the speech for the king that I need to give, that he needs to give to the House of Commons?" And it turns out that then Spencer Compton, while he's trying to get the help of Walpole, Caroline, the Queen, the person that Walpole has been courting, comes up trumps. He says to George, her husband, "Look, if you really want to get the civil list, if you want to get money of the kind that you need, then you need to retain Walpole." And that's exactly what he did. And in return for giving Walpole the prime ministership back, he got a huge reward, a huge civil list, many hundreds of thousands more than George I got. Caroline also got a personal civil list of 100,000, twice as much as any previous consort, and she also got Richmond Lodge and Somerset House. So she came up trumps, and in his very earthy language, he was asked, "How on earth did you get it right?" And he said to a friend, "Well, Spencer Compton, he got the wrong sow by the ear, I the right." And the sow was, for Spencer Compton, was Henrietta Howard of Marble Hill, and his sow was Caroline. So now we'll come to Richmond Park. And probably most of you know that Walpole had some connection. We saw the picture at the front at the first. He was he became Ranger or de facto Ranger but he had a connection with Richmond Park before that. So in the early 1720s, he was a great huntsman. He loved hunting. He came from the squirearchy in Norfolk where they hunted on his own estate, and it was said that he opened letters from his gamekeeper before letters of state. He was so enamoured of hunting. And he often went to Richmond Park, as we know it, New Park as it was known then, with George I. So New Park as opposed to Old Park, where Richmond Lodge was based. Now, Charles I, who set up New Park in 1637, allowed local people to use the park. It wasn't fenced off in the same way as it would later become. But George I found this very annoying, as indeed Walpole did. And Walpole, in order to show his loyalty to the king, was ruthless in defending the rights of the elite against the wishes of the ordinary folk. But you have to remember how starkly different the societies were. So you've got this wonderful park with 2,000 deer, 3,000 wild turkeys as well. It was for many poor people a kind of kitchen, a larder, whereas for the wealthy it was game. They called it game. It was a game. They enjoyed the fun of the hunt. At this time, London was going through a sort of hungry period, and so many people made the journey out in the hope of poaching the deer, and they could get in through the gates. They would sneak through with horses or mules and shoot the deer and then carry them away. They might bribe sometimes the gatekeepers as well, who were in some senses on their side. Here you can see the kind of thing that they would do. Sometimes they would do it en masse to really annoy the king and Walpole. Things came to a head fairly early in Walpole's tenure as Prime Minister, and we'll go to the next slide. So in 1723, the government created this very drastic act called the Black Act. It was named after the poachers who would black their faces so they wouldn't be seen at night. As one of the and this Black Act, which wasn't repealed until the 1820s, created 50 and more new death penalty offences, including something as simple as blacking your face and being caught on a royal park. The intention was to deter poachers. There's some thought that perhaps it was so dangerous, terrible for ordinary people, that there was this sense that it was also meant to be targeting the Jacobites, the people who were supporting James the Pretender, and the fear that they would overthrow the royals. Anyway, in a test case, Walpole went after this man called John Huntridge. Now, John Huntridge was a humble innkeeper, and how am I doing for time? He was a humble innkeeper, and he owned the halfway house near to Robin Hood Gate on the south by Wimbledon Common. And he was, as a publican, often would aid and abet people. Not necessarily, he didn't know that they were, but they were poachers and deer stealers. Anyway, Walpole personally took the case on. He actually tried to elicit evidence against Huntridge, but remarkably, he wasn't successful. A jury of 12 men, good and true, declared Huntridge not guilty, partly on a technicality, and it's now often used, this case, as evidence of how the rule of law was finally getting recognised across England. At a time when there was still the debate about who's really in control. Okay, go to the next slide. So eventually he becomes Ranger. Now, actually, his son becomes Ranger, but he was the de facto one. The reason why he put it in the name of his son was that he wanted it to go on for more than one life, to well beyond his own life. And this was a common thing for the role of Ranger of Richmond Park. And he had been looking for a kind of park like Richmond, where he could do hunting during the parliamentary season. And he, at one point, was looking at Enfield Chase to the north of it, to the north of London. He finally, when Richmond became available, seized on that, and it had been in the family of the Earls of Rochester. Now, if you know York House, you'll know that that was partly owned for a while by Henry Hyde, who was the Earl of Clarendon. And he was the uncle of the people, of the person that had the rangership of Richmond. So there's a lot of local connections. So if you visit York House, you can make that connection. And what Walpole was looking for was both a place to hunt and a place to hide his mistress. So even he had a mistress, Maria Skerritt, who actually he eventually did marry. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. He invested huge amounts of money in Richmond. This was his playground, and you'll recognise the building on the top. That's White Lodge, or the Royal Ballet School, originally called Stone Lodge, and before that, New Lodge. And you can see that it's built in that very Palladian style that was popular in that early period, very classical lines and so on. And the building below, which is not too dissimilar, although very much bigger, is the palace that Walpole built on his Norfolk estate in Houghton. That's Houghton Hall, which you can visit today, and it's a wonderful building. But you can see how kind of similar they are, using that sort of very famous Portland stone as a cover over the brickwork. Now, literally, this was built by George I, and Caroline used it when George II became king, and she built the Queen's Ride as a direct link between the ballet school and Richmond Lodge. The Walpole took it over in 1737 when Caroline died. Go to the next slide. While Caroline was living in, or spending time at White Lodge, Walpole spent time, and as did Maria Skerritt, at this place, which no longer exists. It stood until the 1840s, and it was called Old Lodge to distinguish it from the New Lodge. And it was actually an upgraded, originally a farmhouse. So when Charles I created the new park, he did it by joining a number of farms and a number of estates, including this farm called Hartleton Lodge. And this was very near Pen Ponds. So if you're walking up the road and you've got the White Lodge on the top, up the hill from Pen Ponds and Pen Ponds Cafe, just to your right is pretty much where Old Lodge was. Just by Spanker's Hill, just below Spanker's Hill, which is a run I've done a few times. I can see a few runners here, so this was that stood until the 1840s, and it became very much like a mini Houghton Hall. It's where he did entertaining during the parliamentary season, and until that point, Parliament used to sit, the House of Commons used to sit on a Saturday, and Walpole changed that rule so that it only sat on Mondays to Fridays, and he was allowed to then be able to work from his house in Richmond, and he would always say that he could do more business than he could in town without the hassle and the encumbrances of people knocking on his door in London. Okay, we'll get to the next slide. One other series of changes that he did, he built a whole series of lodges cottages around the key gates. There's Richmond Gate, there's Sheen Gate, there's Robin Hood Gate, and this one he built or updated. It's called Aldridge Lodge, and you'll know it as the thatched house lodge, which still exists and it's used today. And that was originally called Aldridge Lodge. It was two houses. It's now been pulled together as one, but that still stands. Many of the buildings don't exist. Here you can see Old Lodge that we were just talking about. There's New Lodge, which was basically the Royal Ballet School. Here you've got Richmond Hill Gate, and this is the Robin Hood Gate where John Huntridge had his pub. Walpole spent time not just building but also clearing a lot of the bogs. As Horace Walpole, his son, famous writer and Strawberry Hill resident, he called the park a bog and a harbour for deer stealers and vagabonds, and Walpole spent time clearing that. Of course, that was to great impact on the ordinary people, because they would use the bogs for cutting turf, for heat and so on. So that was intended to be a strike against them. Okay, get to the next one. So the last, before I go to the end couple of slides, in 1735, Walpole became the first resident of Downing Street. This was originally 3 houses that he had knocked together by William Kent, and it's been the residence of prime ministers since then. And he spent time from 1735, when he was in London, there and during the week, and then at the weekends going to Richmond. So he did that journey, Richmond to Downing Street, many times. Okay. So just to Walpole, often historians talk about the fall of Walpole, but he lost control of office in 1742 and died in 1745. But the connection between the Walpole family in the area didn't die with him. Of course, he was wanting to make sure that it continued afterwards by putting the rangership in the name of his son, Robert Walpole, who became the second Earl of Orford. Walpole, just before his death, accepted a peerage as the first Earl of Orford, but he didn't last very long. He died in 6 years after Walpole, aged 50. So that was Robert. Another son was Edward, who never married but lived locally. He lived in this rather splendid mansion in Isleworth, which doesn't obviously exist anymore. And he had several children, one of whom is this lady here called Charlotte, who married Lionel Tolmarsh, who was the 5th Earl of Dysart, as in Dysart Arms. And she lived in Ham House. So if you go through the main entrance, next time you're in Ham House, you go through the main entrance. On your right is this wonderful portrait of Charlotte, produced by Joshua Reynolds, the painter. So that was the second son. Then there's the youngest son, Horace, and I haven't spent much time on him because I think most of us know a lot about him or have heard about him from previous talks. But he was the third son and the 4th Earl of Orford. There was a 3rd Earl, which I'll come on to finally. And he of course lived in Strawberry Hill. He was a wonderful letter writer, and Yale University Press have produced a collection of his letters in 48 volumes. But he's a great source of gossip. Okay, and then we come to the last one. Anybody recognise this building? Hermitage, yes. Hermitage, so this is in St. Petersburg, this is the Winter Palace. The Hermitage is even bigger, the whole thing. And this was the great creation of Catherine the Great. So we're going to the next slide. And the reason why I put this up is here on the left is George Walpole, who's the grandson of Robert Walpole, and he was the third Earl of Orford. And but he was rather dissolute character, as often third generations are. They talk about the first generation makes the success, the second generation sustains it, and the third generation loses it. And this is really what happened with George Walpole, who was the owner of Houghton Hall. But he was an inveterate gambler, and to pay for his debts, he sold Walpole's collection of paintings. And the Walpole collection is one of the great collections of this period. And in a sense, Horace Walpole, his son, who's a great art critic, you can understand the kind of the connection. But in the 1770s, he was desperate to find a bidder for the art. Catherine the Great was looking for a foundation collection for the Hermitage, the Winter Palace, and found it in this collection. And it was all masterminded by a man called James Christie, as in the auctioneer. This was his first great auction, which really made his name. And the collection included Van Dyck, Poussin, Rubens, Rembrandt, most of which were hung in Houghton, but some of them had been presented in the Richmond Lodge, in the old lodge, where Walpole spent quite a lot of time during the parliamentary season. And so it's an interesting connection as you walk around and you can see the paintings. If you go to the Hermitage today, there's still many there, something like 120 still there. You can visit them and wonder which ones are likely to have hung in Richmond Park, just around the corner. Well, thanks so much. I'm happy to answer any questions.
That was rather a tour de force, wasn't it? I first met Simon when he was wearing a t-shirt and running shorts, as was I. And we both tend to go most Saturday mornings to Old Deer Park Run. And there are at least half a dozen people in the audience who also go to Old Deer Park Run. It's a very good event. You don't have to run, but you have to enjoy cake afterwards. I'm sure there's other people on Zoom from Park Run too. But what I didn't realize when I met Simon was, I soon worked out he's a very good runner. I didn't realize what an excellent speaker he is. I think he's done a really good talk. So now it's your turn. Can you speak? Can you think of a question to ask Simon?
Hello. Yep.
Can you wait for the microphone?
So they can hear it on Zoom, I think.
It'll look after itself.
You spoke about his sons, but you didn't speak about his cousin. And he had a famous cousin, Anne Seymour, who became an international sculptor.
Ah.
Her father was, her family were the Lord of Argyll, and Mr. Seymour became a general, and his wife very carefully went round everywhere with him, leaving Anne very much free. And she was a great person for the theatre and other things. But what she was famous for, especially in the days when women weren't able to do things, and she became an international sculptor. Ah. Her work is in Florence and in, I believe, in Rome, but I haven't been to see it, so I'm not sure. It was certainly in London and in the British Museum. And when he died, he left the use of Strawberry Hill to her for her lifetime. Well, she looked after it until she was about 70. And then she said it was really too much effort to maintain all Strawberry Hill. So she bought York House. Ah, yes. And that's where she lived until she died. And after she died, Strawberry Hill went back to his family. I don't know whether they were a bit miffed at having somebody, even a cousin, taking over Strawberry Hill, but when she died, it went back to the family.
Sounds like another talk for future, doesn't it?
What I always find interesting about our talks is we have interesting information from the speaker, but then the audience take over. And
Actually, one person I didn't mention, I could have done, was talking of cousins, was a man called the Marquis of Cholmondeley, or Cholmondeley, it looks like. So I don't know if any of you have walked, well, you will have done, walked along Cholmondeley Walk. And Walpole's daughter, Lady Mary, married into the Cholmondeley family, and it's the Cholmondeleys who now own Houghton in Norfolk. So yeah, if you go to that, you may even be shown around by the Marquis of Cholmondeley, who's a very leading aristocrat.
yes.
You mentioned that the term Prime Minister really came in officially in 1878 with Disraeli. I always thought of it as being a term applied to these guys, forever and a day. What were they being referred to as Prime Minister popularly before Disraeli's time?
Oh, yes. Yes,
right,
so
yes.
What I meant was that, so in Walpole's time, it was very much a term of abuse. By the 1730s, it was more commonly used. He was also known as the great man, and everybody knew what it was meant because he was actually a rather short, dumpy man and very large. He was 20 stone. So it was a sort of play on words when he was talked about as being the great man. Prime Minister was definitely used, but of course they didn't have the power that our prime ministers have. There was no such thing as cabinet government. He couldn't choose his ministers. They were still chosen by the king. And it really wasn't until William Pitt the Younger, who was the second longest serving prime minister, 19 years, that the idea of prime minister with cabinet power and real influence really came to be commonly used.
And people were thinking of Pitt as prime minister,
Yes.
or Peel as prime minister.
Yes.
Yeah.
But what Walpole did was make it clear that that the kings could no longer rule without the influence and support of somebody who had the command of the House of Commons. That's the thing. So, for instance, with Spencer Compton, he tried to make Spencer Compton the Prime Minister, or his advisor, but because he didn't have the command of House of Commons, it was never going to work.
Next. No more questions. I'm surprised.
Famous inhabitants is a historian called Ken Burns. When he made a film about himself, he eulogized this town of Walpole for an hour in his program, never once mentioned where the name came from. Oh. So which Walpole would Walpole in Maine have been named after? Presumably.
Oh gosh, that's a curveball, isn't it? I don't know. I don't know, honestly. I suppose it probably was after, potentially one of the family. I mean, Walpole was interesting in so far as he didn't have much interest in foreign politics, foreign policy, and one of his great claims to fame was keeping Britain out of foreign wars. Again, in contrast to the period beforehand. And in the end, he was persuaded to persuaded to go and send troops into battle against the Spanish at the behest of the merchants. In 1739, there was a famous War of Jenkins' Ear. Does anyone know that story? Anyway, the War of Jenkins' Ear, and this was a battle when. The reason why I mention this is because it was a battle when soldiers from the American colonies fought alongside the redcoats against the Spanish in the Caribbean and so on. In fact, one of the soldiers that fought was a man called Lawrence Washington. And Lawrence Washington was the elder brother of George Washington. And Lawrence Washington served under a British admiral called Admiral Vernon. And if you go to America now and you go to where Washington lived and so on, you'll go to a place called Mount Vernon, which was named by Lawrence and subsequently George after this great British admiral. I don't know about the Walpole story. Bit of a detour.
Yes, back please.
Thank you. I was looking at a painting this afternoon of Robert Walpole in Chelsea Old Town Hall. They've got 4 mural paintings put up in 1911, 1912 of famous people associated with Chelsea, and they're divided into literature, art, history, science. And Robert Walpole was in the science group. I couldn't understand what he was doing there. Do you know why he would be regarded as a scientist and what his connection with Chelsea might have been?
So I don't know what his sciences, other than science, could be just to do with knowledge more broadly, as opposed to the way we think of science. So the word science has changed its meaning over time. But he was connected to Chelsea. He lived in Chelsea. He was also connected to the Chelsea Hospital, the charity, as in the Royal Hospital. In fact, it was another charity where he used his financial acumen to make money on the side. So he kind of bled dry the Chelsea Hospital Foundation while he was there. But he loved. I mean, of all the places that he lived outside Houghton in Norfolk, Chelsea was the place he most often wanted to return to. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions? Because if not, I'd like to say a very big thank you to Simon for really running with this topic and giving us a most entertaining talk. Very informative.
Thank you.
As a token of our appreciation, Simon.
Oh gosh, thank you very much. That's great. That made it all worth it.
Thank you. When we as I mentioned to you, Simon has written an article for last year's journal. If you haven't got one, please go and buy one, because it's a very good article about Francis Drake and Elizabeth I. Very, very, very well researched. I'm hoping you'll write this up for next year's journal. When we do our running on Saturday mornings, we try and run as fast as we can. We also know at the end of it, there's usually a cake to eat. Unfortunately, we don't have that, but we do. Some of us go to the pub afterwards. So if you want to hang around, we go to the Duke after the talk. You going to come, Simon?
I shall do.
Simon will be there. I'm sure you can ask him some more questions if you want to. Otherwise, see you on the second Monday in December. I've forgotten which date that is, but we'll have a local author who lives in Kew called George Goodwin, talking about Christmas traditions with particular reference to Richmond and Kew. So I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's fantastic.